conclude, which is my task here, it's important to note that this is a plan of action, a group of people, a concert of action, of which are carrying out a policy of genocide, which no nation is exempt in any part of the world. And in our package, we have gone through that at least to identify. I can inform you that we are now working on more elaborated, detailed documentation of this case of the WWF and Royal Crown policy of genocide, for example, against the nation of China, against other parts of the world. Tonight, or this afternoon, we're going to finish with the case of the Americas, because there's a very specific idea and concept that jumps out of you that's inescapable when you look at this policy in the Americas, and that is the concept that these people have of people as animals. And you see it in the name and the face of indigenism, which is now tearing apart, in particular, Ibero-America and Canada, in armed insurgencies such as Shining Path and the Zapatistas in Chiapas. And these people who view man as animals are using the indigenous movement today as the principal means to cull the human flock as a whole, and you can see this in the case of the Americas. But let's go straight to the maps. Now, I just want to note a few things generally, not all the things that we've even noted. If you look at the total amount of protected area, as we have calculated it thus far, it's 13.2% of the total area of South America. I would submit to you that this is vastly underestimated. Now, since we've begun this work, and I do recommend that people work through the documentation, familiarize themselves with the maps, learn the categories that these people use, because you, as you go back to your nations, will be able to refine this picture we've developed. For example, in the case of Argentina, we used, as we did for most of the areas, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature statistics. These are very low in most cases, and they vary. Some countries are more accurate than others. In the case of Argentina, the figures that we have discovered since we produced this is that 36% of the country is a so-called protected area. So I submit that you will find that these figures are going to change as we get more refined national-based statistics. Second of all, what do you notice about the area? If you know anything about the South American drug production, centered in the Amazon region, in the Amazon basin, note the density of parks in that area. Look particularly at point number 4, all right? That's in Peru. Now, that is a reserved area, an ecological reserved area in the Huallaga Valley. That is the heart of the coca-producing region in Peru. Peru being one of the 2 largest producers of coca, which, as you know, is used for cocaine in the world. As in Africa, you see the cross-border case. All right, many of these are concentrated on the borders. For today's purpose, look at number 1. Now, what you're looking at there is the indigenous reserve of the Yanomami Park. It's an area, it's divided in 2. One side is Brazilian, and that's strictly called the Yanomami Park, and the other side in Venezuela is called the Alto Orinoco Biosphere Reserve, run by UNESCO, of Mr. Huxley's fame. This is an area of about 178,000 square kilometers. In other words, something short, just shy of the territory of the state of Uruguay, that was created in 1991, I might add, by 2 presidents who were driven from power on charges of corruption, Carlos Andrés Pérez and Color de Melo. They're no longer around. And the creators of the Yanomami parks are a little worried because they don't have the instrument at hand to actually put through their program that they want. Now, this park was created in order to protect some 16,000 semi-nomadic Indians who live in some of the most primitive, horrible conditions known to man. They practice cannibalism and infanticide. That means they kill any child that they want to. They die at half the national, their average lifespan is half the national lifespan of the rest of the nation. For example, in Venezuela, average age, die at 35. If they continue in this culture, they will disappear. The creators of the Yanomami Park knowingly are attempting to set up a green wall around these, out of which the Yanomami people, I submit they are human beings, cannot escape. They cannot go out. They cannot change their culture. They cannot do that. And therefore they are going to die. That's the policy of the World Wildlife Fund. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole documentation here, but we know, and we have documented, that the creation of the Yanomami Park was a personal task of the British royal family and the World Wildlife Fund. It was carried out by an organization set up as an offshoot of the World Wildlife Fund in 1969, which was originally called the Primitive Peoples Fund. That name was a little too harsh, they said. In Africa and in the United States, people sort of said, well, this just doesn't fly. So they renamed that organization Survival International. And many of you may have run across them. They're an international organization which campaigns for the defense of tribal peoples. The tribal peoples must stay as only tribal peoples. It was funded by the World Wildlife Fund. Sir Peter Scott, chairman of the World Wildlife Fund, was one of the sponsors of Survival International. Several of the other people involved in it came out of the World Wildlife Fund. Financier of the operation, Teddy Goldsmith, the leader of the magazine called The Ecologist, one of the most rabid anti-industrial magazines on the face of the earth. And its first and major task from its formation in 1969 was the creation of the Yanomami Parks. For the first 3 years, Survival International targeted Brazil and Brazil's policy of assimilating its very small Indian population into its national structure. Now, there's another thing that stands out about the Yanomami Park. When looking at this, we discovered that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature has 8 categories that they recognize of different kinds of protected areas. You can have national forests, you can have parks where people cannot go in, you can have parks for ecology, you can have parks for tourism, various different categories of protection. Category number 7 of the IUCN is quote-unquote an anthropological reserve. Now on this map, you can't tell the difference between what's an animal reserve, a nature reserve, and a people's reserve, because they have no distinction. But all I can tell you is that in Colombia, this is very advanced. They have 250 Indian reserves, Category 7, IUCN. And Brazil has 253 already demarcated and is going towards 514 Indian reserves, anthropological zoos. Okay, now what do they do with the Indians that they protect? Look at number 5. That's in Peru. That's a park called the Apurimac Reserve. It's an ecological reserve located between 2 rivers and near the Eni River. The park rangers for the Apurimac Reserve was Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso. When the Peruvian army finally fought its way in to the area, they found 1,200 bodies of Ashinanka Indians buried in mass graves, 300 mass graves, that they had operated in there. There are 5,000 missing of these Indians. No one knows what has happened to them. Now, if you think that London has nothing to do with Shining Path, you're very wrong. The Peruvian government has, over a number of years, has attempted to get the British government to shut down the center of propaganda for Shining Path that's run out of London, and to no avail. But then in 1992, in August, a British government agency known as the Independent Broadcasting Authority, IBA, whose chief is appointed by the Home Office, produced for Shining Path the sole international documentary propaganda film that Shining Path has shown around the world. IBA, the Independent Broadcasting Authority, sent its reporters to Peru. They accompanied Sendero Luminoso to their films, to their fields, their killing fields. They filmed them. They broadcasted it on British TV. And then, lo and behold, we start getting in our center flyers from the Revolutionary Communist Party in the United States, which backs Shining Path, saying, come see, we've got the first documentary film produced by IBA. It was fundraising for Shining Path, run by this Home Office-controlled outfit. So the park rangers of the Apurimac Reserve tell us what these people view about Indians. They want to kill them. The next slide. Yeah. I'm going to, given the time, and I want people to have time to ask some questions, I'm going to skip most of the Central American aspect, although there's some crucial things. One thing I want to note is there is a plan afoot to create one single park all the way through this called the Paseo Pantera. It's a path for panthers to run up and down. And you know, these panthers, they really need to be all connected, and that right now they have to run through human territory, and that can't be allowed. So this is what is being discussed. And this, I identify for anybody who knows some history, is the Mosquito Coast. And if anybody later wants to see, I have maps we've produced for a coming issue of EIR of what this Honduras and Nicaragua, this is Honduras, this being Nicaragua, looked like in 1850 when the entirety of this region was a protectorate, an Indian protectorate run by the British Crown called Mosquitia. Today it's being reconstituted, and we have the maps for what it's projected to look like in the year 2000. And it's going to look an awful lot like 1850. Now, you have to hold... Now, here's where you see, I ask you to read the section on the Americas. We detail there the role of the WWF in the 4 major parks that are in Chiapas, out of which drugs and the Zapatistas are deployed. I'm not going to review it here. But what I want to point to is the other second way in which indigenism works, because this isn't just focused on using Indians to keep these Indians behind their green walls so that they cannot become human beings. All right, that's a very small portion of the human race that they're directly killing through indigenism. Indigenism is also deployed by the British Crown and the WWF to destroy the global economy and to return all of man back to a state of hunting and gathering, nomadism, pastoral, you know, whatever. And in the case of Chiapas, this is very interesting. In May of 1994, Teddy Goldsmith's magazine, The Ecologist, endorsed the Zapatista uprising. And he endorsed it on the basis that most people think, I mean, if you think about what the media said, what has the media said? That the Zapatista Indians, the EZLN, are an uprising because they've been left in backwardness, and that, you know, an unfair treatment. That's not what the Ecologist said. What the Ecologist said is that they are it's an uprising against development, against the fact that the government was interrupting the backward lifestyle by bringing them development, and therefore the Goldsmith, the WWF, are backing the Zapatista uprising. We have in production now something you'll find interesting, a map we found in one of the WWF Atlas of the Worlds, which is the map called Indigenous Peoples Under Threat. It matches, you know, rhinos under threat, elephants under threat, indigenous peoples under threat. One more animal. Listed on that map are the Mayans in the Lancadon jungle. That's Chiapas, for those that don't know. That's the Zapatista uprising. That's one of the indigenous peoples under threat that the WWF is working on. I suggest one of the things also that people can begin to do is play with these maps. When you find the map of your country, look at it, you know your country. For example, Mexicans have been very interested when you map the density of ecological zones and protected areas on Mexico's oil production region. You find a very interesting story. It's the heart of Mexico's oil production region. Next. Now we want to go to North America. And I want to conclude with this, but I specifically emphasize this because too many people tend to think that this is directed only against the developing sector. that this is a strategy of which the United States and the northern nations are exempt. And I think as you examine that map, you'll see that that is not the case. In the case of Canada, I don't know if you can see it, says the number 3, the striped area, all, can you see it on the north? The striped area on the north. Now you may, in your mind, think that's Canada. In the Queen of England's mind, that's a new nation called Nunavut, which you may not have known about before. I didn't until we began this. Created in 1993, by 1999, that is to be an independent nation of that much of Canada. And it is a nation created for the Inuit Indians. This is the autonomous separatist geopolitical strategy moving into action. The other stripe in the other direction, number 2, is what the Cree Indians are claiming of Quebec, and it's 2/3 of Quebec. So in Canada, you see the face of the same thing that we saw in Central and South America, the beginning of the division of these nations, the split up of these nations through so-called indigenism. Now then we go to the United States, that many people think as a great power, all right, exempt from this. And I submit to you that if you look at the degree of areas under control, it tells a story that most Americans have to understand and other people have to understand as well. Here are your straight, the dark areas are your straight protected areas, the categories that I mentioned before. Your Bureau of Land Management lines, which are the lighter brown, technically do not have to be absolutely protected. There's some human activity allowed on these lands still. However, that is rapidly being changed, particularly under the direction of the Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt, a member, was to be chairman of the Inter-American Dialogue before he went into the Clinton administration, now involved in a scandal in Houston with Margaret Thatcher's son. He's been one of the prime British agents within the administration that has been turning this huge area of land, largely into the West, through ecological regulations into an area in which mankind cannot move. Human activity is not allowed. And if you look at this, what you see then is the entire western part of the United States, and look at Alaska, the similar picture, being kept out of development, being kept for beginning the balkanization of the country. And I think the last slide. What we're looking towards, if this is not stopped, is this thing. This is a project published in 1981, a book called The 9 Nations of America, to balkanize, divide up the North America as a whole. The islands, this is Mex-America, Cascadia, or Ecotopia is given to the number 2. Number 1, look at that, it's called the Empty Corridor, and isn't that exactly what we just saw in the maps before? New England, I guess they're going to just go back to slave trading, that's what's left for them, etc. And so what you have here is a operational plan of which no nation, and particularly not the United States, is exempt, being carried out by this group of people who are committed to eradicating the nation-state itself as an existence on this planet and reducing man to species, 5,000 different species, each with a different culture, living in the most horrible, primitive backwardness one can imagine. And I submit we should have questions.
The operations in your country, Mr. are largely run out of the Australia wing, as you probably know, of the WWF, right? Which is run by a guy named Malcolm Parker, who was the extra equerry, that is, the chief aide to Prince Philip for a long time. There got to be a big scandal because his wife divorced him because she maintained that he was spending all his time in nightclubs with Prince Philip, where the only thing the women wore who were dancing on the stage was Freemasonic aprons. So he got in a big scandal. He was kicked out of England or had to leave England in disgrace. He went over to become the personal aide-de-camp to Prince Bernard, Same thing happened, and he wound up in Australia, from which he's directing the operations, which I want to show you. Now, if you look at this, this is just quite incredible, right? Look at this. This is the protected areas being given, so-called, to the Aborigine population. Now, look at this. This is not everything. What's actually been created now is an unbroken, virtually, except for tiny little areas across the transcontinental highway there, reserve to actually break the nation in two, right? The green areas here are the lands that are claimed. You're probably aware of the famous Mabo decision of 1992, right, which opens up all land to anybody who says, well, I once was an Aborigine, or maybe my great-great-grandfather was. The incidence of Aborigines has gone up threefold once Mabo happened, right? Because if I have any Aboriginal land, well, then why don't I just grab Melbourne? One tribe grabbed Brisbane, grabbed downtown Brisbane, or tried to, and then finally they cut a deal and they gave it up. It's chaos in the whole area. So the idea is to actually totally disintegrate the texture of the country as a sovereign country. And I think the point that Webster made is the crucial one for all of us to remember. Back in 1981-82, we called the WWF. We and other journalists associated, we called those guys. And because our hypothesis was, well, aren't they stealing all the, say, diamond area? And there's a lot of diamonds out through there, right? Or in the case of Namibia. Most of the area in Namibia that's locked up along the coast is the diamond-rich area. Same thing with Botswana. The whole diamond belt of Botswana is locked up. So we, being a little bit suspicious after dealing with these characters for a long time, we said, well, is this to lock up raw materials? The WWF guy himself said to us, no, that's the old form of imperialism. What we're preparing is for a cataclysmic collapse of human civilization, where as much as 95 to 98% of the population will die, and we will rebuild out of the ashes. We who have, the means of control. And he said the 1001 Club is a club modeled upon Whites or Boodles or the famous London clubs, right? Where you have to be requested to join and be backed by 2 other sponsors in order to be allowed in. It's not just any guy who has $10,000. Interestingly, he pointed out that one of the reserves that the 1001 Club was looking to flee to when the chaos descended was Australia. And so I guess Prince Philip has sent his old drinking buddy, Malcolm Parker, down there to prepare the way. So as far as Papua New Guinea, look out. And perhaps we could talk a bit more afterwards about that situation. Yes.
I think there's another dimension to this as well. Remember, constantly keep in mind that the overarching policy commitment of the WWF apparatus is to, over the next 2 to 3 generations, drive the population of the world to well below 1 billion people. It's at over 5 billion people right now, so that gives you a rough idea of what their general demographic concepts are. And in their literature, they've been very explicit about the kinds of things that they wish to do to make this possible. Bertrand Russell, who was one of the architects of this genocidal outlook, lamented the fact that the existing levels of disease, pestilence, famine, and warfare that were going on towards the closing years of his life, which was the 1960s, was insufficient to accomplish this task. And so he said some extremely distasteful measures are going to have to be taken up in order to reach these kinds of objectives. Now, one of the sine qua nons of the entire WWF agenda is the complete and total elimination of any form of economic development. Teddy Goldsmith, who's the older brother and the philosophical mentor of Sir Jimmy Goldsmith, who's probably the more well-known of the two, has written a number of books which he was criticized for by some of the WWF people because he was letting a bit too many of the secrets out on the table. He wrote a book in 1966 called Blueprint for Survival, in which he advocated the most radical population control policies that have been denounced all over the world, that have been carried out by the Chinese government and others, namely forced sterilization, literally infanticide, and measures like this to reach the intended population goals. He proposed in 1966 a permanent global ban on all migration, so that wherever you are in the world, you're stuck there. And then more recently, in 1980, he wrote a book called The Great U-Turn, in which he said that all of the evils of civilization and all of the problems of civilization have been caused by industry, industrialization, and the advent of modern technology, and therefore it's essential to turn the clock back radically and go back to literally an early form of global feudalism. WWF carefully studies the maps of every region that they've targeted, and in their minds the first target that must be destroyed is any potential project that would represent economic development that would improve the material, cultural standards of living of the population living in that area. And as Gretchen said, the advanced sector is by no means excluded from this. In Europe, the WWF spokesmen have recently been completely explicit about the fact that they intend to destroy every proposed plan for the economic reintegration of East and West Europe. They have set up parks for life, which are specifically earmarked to be choke points against every major proposed high-speed rail line and other infrastructure project that would fundamentally end the Cold War period by reintegrating Eastern and Western Europe, which creates the potential for the economic development of all of Eurasia. In Mexico, in Africa, in every part of the world where there are oil reserves, those areas are targeted for shutdown because these people are evil, they're insane, but they're not stupid. They know that the key to population density, the capacity for a society to increase its population by advancing its levels of public health, culture, education, and technology, is the energy throughput. And they know that there is far from a shortage of oil. They control certain global strategic raw material preserves, oil preserves, and they target certain new potential expanded oil reserves. They've decimated any prospect of nuclear energy as a viable future source of energy for this planet. And they do all of these things not to make a buck, although they always bear in mind that replenishing their coffers is an aspect always of their geopolitics. Their goal is to make sure that they prevent any kind of expansion of energy availability, which is the crucial factor in being able to bring development rapidly to parts of the world that they've prevented from that. So they've got a world map, and any region which is an area that could rapidly produce and bring to market vast amounts of oil, particularly as a transition into a post-petroleum nuclear technology era, is going to be a priority strategic target because it's the antithesis of the mass murder that they're out to accomplish.
Of nature statistics. These are very low in most cases, and they vary. Some countries are more accurate than others. In the case of Argentina, the figures that we have discovered since we produce this is that 36% of the country is a so-called protected area. So I submit that you will find that these figures are going to change as we get more refined national-based statistics. Second of all, what do you notice about the area? If you know anything about the South American drug production, centered in the Amazon region, in the Amazon basin, note the density of parks in that area. Look particularly at point number 4, all right? That's in Peru. Now, that is a reserved area, an ecological reserved area in the Huallaga Valley. That is the heart of the coca-producing region in Peru. Peru being one of the 2 largest producers of coca, which, as you know, is used for cocaine in the world. As in Africa, you see the cross-border case. All right? Many of these are concentrated on the borders. For today's purpose, look at number 1. Now, what you're looking at there is the indigenous reserve of the Yanomami Park. It's an area, it's divided in 2. One side is Brazilian, and that's strictly called the Yanomami Park, and the other side in Venezuela is called the Alto Orinoco. conclude, which is my task here, it's important to note that this is a plan of action, a group of people, a concert of action, of which are carrying out a policy of genocide, which no nation is exempt in any part of the world. And in our package, we have gone through that at least to identify. I can inform you that we are now working on more elaborated, detailed documentation of this case of the WWF and Royal Crown policy of genocide, for example, against the nation of China, against, see this in the case of the Americas. But let's go straight to the maps. Now, I just want to note a few things generally, not all the things that we've even noted. If you look at the total amount of protected area, as we have calculated it thus far, it's 13.2% of the total area of South America. I would submit to you that this is vastly underestimated. Now, since we've begun this work, and I do recommend that people work through the documentation, familiarize themselves with the maps, learn the categories that these people use, because you, as you go back to your nations, will be able to refine this picture we've developed. For example, in the case of Argentina, we used, as we did for most of the areas, the International Union for the Conservation of Other Parts of the World. Tonight, or this afternoon, we're going to finish with the case of the Americas, because there's a very specific idea and concept that jumps out of you that's inescapable when you look at this policy in the Americas. And that is the concept that these people have of people as animals. And you see it in the name and the face of indigenism, which is now tearing apart, in particular, Ibero-America and Canada, in armed insurgencies such as Shining Path and the Zapatistas in Chiapas. And these people who view man as animals are using the indigenous movement today as the principal means to cull the human flock as a whole. And you can